All across North America, statues of historical figures have become a flashpoint for protest and celebration. I remember some years ago driving by the massive and impressive Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia. And I asked myself, was it intended to express Southern pride, or the longing for a bygone era when African Americans knew their place and were servants and slaves? At the moment, we're struggling with monuments in Canada. These statues may represent a past, but do they reflect the kind of society we desire? The messages that come from statues are often confusing and contradictory, and is it any wonder that they are controversial? Around the corner from us in Baden, the statue of Sir John A. Mcdonald has been repeatedly vandalized and is now in storage. His statue in Charlottetown was taken down last week, and for all his achievements as the first Prime Minister of Canada, there was a dark side to him. After forbidding First Nations people from farming and hunting, he perpetuated the starvation death of thousands of Plains First Nations in an effort to control them and make way for the Canadian Pacific Railroad. He started residential schools and the move to remove children from their parents. So, he said, they do not grow up among savages, as he said to the House of Commons. In Halifax, a couple of years ago, they dismantled the statue of Edward Cornwallis, and he was the founder of the city of Halifax in 1749. He also introduced the Scalping Proclamation and offered a cash bounty for every native person who was killed. There are appeals to take down the statue of Egerton Ryerson. He devised the concept of residential schools as a separate and inferior stream from white children. He didn't want those people competing for limited high-paying jobs, and because he said First Nations children were best suited to be farmhands and laborers. The original monument for Duncan Campbell Scott lauded him as a Confederation poet because he was born in the 1860s. And he was also the recipient of numerous awards and honorary degrees. He served in the Department of Indian Affairs for 52 years and implemented the residential schools. He said he would do it at half the cost of the American system. And he did so by reducing food and medical services and permitting medical experimentation on children. Yes, he said, they do die at a higher rate. In fact, half the children in these schools, he said, do not live to see the benefit of their education. But it is the final solution. The phrase, the final solution, was used by the Nazis in herding Jewish people into concentration camps. You might think when he said half the kids do not survive, the death rate of 50%, was exaggerated, but it wasn't. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Now, there were whistleblowers in this horrifying scenario. One of them was Florence Nightingale, a famous nurse, who said the statistics are so bad, surely they must be inaccurate or fiction. Nevertheless, she appealed for reform and challenged the colonialist spirit, where profit and power were all that mattered. But the most famous whistleblower in Canada was Dr. Peter Bryce. His story is told in the March 2020 issue of the Canadian Medical Association Journal. He was the chief medical officer of health in the early 1900s. He said 25% of pupils in residential schools die of tuberculosis. But he said that is a misleading statistic. He said 69% of ex-pupils are dead because when the kids got very sick and close to death, they were shipped off to home to die. In one school, he found that 76% of children had died. Let that sink in for a moment. 76% of children in a school had died in childhood. As a leading world-class expert in tuberculosis, he pleaded for better ventilation in schools, more medical care, the separation of healthy children from the sick ones. And his findings were published both in a book and in the newspapers. But his appeals were ignored or turned down, and in the end he was fired by the government as a troublemaker. Today his simple gravestone in Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa has become a shrine. There is another famous man with schools and roads named after him. His name, Bishop Vital Grandan. He lobbied the government to build residential schools which would be run by the churches. He said with profound conviction, "We will instill in them, those Indian children, a pronounced distaste for the native life, so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children will have lost everything native except their blood." But it was not so simple a task to take the Indian out of the child. They could not be brutal enough. They used electric chairs for punishment, cages, stripping and caning in the presence of the whole class, be they boys or girls or young teenagers. Piercing the tongue with pins if they spoke their own native language. And some were sadists, some were sexual predators. The dorm rooms had nighttime callers, and boys and girls were sexually abused, and if a girl got pregnant, she was compelled to pray for her abuser. Given this kind of history, one should not be surprised by the horror and unspeakable tragedy of Kamloops. And one suspects there are horrible discoveries that are yet to be made. Most survivors of these residential schools were deeply damaged and brought back to their homes and communities the dysfunction and abuse they grew up with in school. What do you do in the face of overwhelming pain and oppression and injustice? What hope is there when you're up against the force of culture and habit? What do you do when First Nations people and other racialized groups experience racism in the healthcare system, or at the hands of the law and justice systems, or that close to 40% of Indigenous children live in poverty? How do we respond? We live in a world where it seems there is no end to injustice, suffering, and pain. Consider the time when Jesus lived. Israel was occupied by Roman invaders, and it seemed that life could not get any worse. The Pharisees believed that prayer and following all the correct religious rituals was the answer. But pietism without action soon becomes manipulation and legalism. The Sadducees and the tax collectors chose to be collaborators. They made a profitable living for themselves, working, of course, with the Roman occupiers. And they were happy with the status quo. Their lives were cushy and good, and they had no concern for those who were suffering. And the religious Pharisees and the wealthy Sadducees together were the most powerful religious political group in Israel at that time. Attacking them was foolish and dangerous. You'd put your own life at risk. But Jesus went at them with reckless abandon. He called them whited sepulchres, whitewashed tombstones, pretty on the outside, but dead inside. And like a wounded snake, they writhed under his blistering attack, and they pushed back. They said, well, Jesus is in league with the devil, Beelzebub. And the atmosphere was tense and on the brink of violence. No wonder Jesus' mother and brothers came to the rescue. They knew Jesus could not win a battle against the Sadducees and Pharisees. And they say, please, let's calm down. Do not pay any attention to Jesus. He has mental issues, He's a little crazy. Let him come with us, and we will look after him and keep him under wraps. But Jesus pays no attention to his mother or brothers. He who had turned the water into wine for the sake of his mother at a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee rebukes his family. His agenda was far deeper than they imagined. He was here to open the window to God's prodigal love, to heal the sick and bring hope to the despairing, to show that there is a new kind of way of living. He breaks down walls of separation. He speaks to a Samaritan woman and gives her a lesson in theology. He spends time with drunks and the most derided of sinners. He reminds the pious of God's care for all people, and that God's love extends beyond national boundaries. He reminded the congregation that gathered in the synagogue in Nazareth that God's grace and healing from leprosy was extended to Naaman, a Syrian general, as if there were not enough lepers in Israel. He reminded them how Elijah fed a Syrophoenician widow, as if there were not enough impoverished widows in their own land. He set off a ticking time bomb, and the assembly was enraged, ready to throw him off a cliff. They were committed to their religious nationalism. Sometimes truth-telling is a dangerous and unpopular thing, whether it is an ancient Jewish story or the shame and heartbreak of residential schools and our history of genocide in Canada. Are we judging our forebears too harshly with the sensibilities of today? Were they wicked people? Were they dark and evil with no conscience? Yes, there were some like that. There were others who were drawn into the spirit of colonization, acquisition of land and profit, which mattered more than people. Those temptations are still with us today. What can we do? We can begin with lament and grief over what has been. We grieve not only about Kamloops and the tragedy there, but generations of abuse. Perhaps we commit to learn even more. With knowledge may come greater insight and understanding, and I hope so. But we need to move beyond sentiment and words. I wonder if we will be open to what justice may mean for them today. And not least, we can look forward with hope and work towards a new and better day. We started out talking about monuments. Let me end with one that inspires me. It is Christ the Redeemer, towering almost 60 meters above the summit of Mount Corcovado. It looks down on the mansions and favelas of Rio, with arms outstretched in an expression of love and welcome. Whether we think of the Jesus of history, who walked the dusty trails of Palestine 2,000 years ago, or the Christ of faith. He is our hope and the way for today and tomorrow. He taught us the meaning of love unlimited and what it means to be community, where every person of every age and color and sex is beloved. Lord, make us instruments of your kind of world. Amen.